Can you hear me, Professor Esack?
Yes, Alex, I can hear you and I can see you.
Okay, wonderful. We will get started. So, Sani Bunani, Dumelang, welcome to all, Salam, Shalom, to Africa for Palestine's weekly webinar series. The title of our series is Israeli Apartheid Through South African Eyes. This week's episode or topic is Apartheid, the chosen people and the colonization of God. We have, again, this week, are very privileged to have Professor Farid Esack, and my name is Alex, and I am a volunteer at Africa for Palestine. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Africa for Palestine, formerly known as BDS South Africa, focuses on strengthening African-Palestinian relations and pushing back against apartheid Israel's infiltration and influence into the continent of Africa. We work with solidarity groups, trade unions, political formations, and human rights organizations across the African continent who have our same spirit of progressive internationalism and a commitment to standing with other oppressed peoples all over the world. Our presenter for tonight is Farid Esack, Professor Farid Esack, who is a South African Muslim liberation theologian, a veteran of the South African anti-apartheid struggle, and a professor of Islam at the University of Johannesburg. He currently serves on the board of Africa for Palestine. Just to give our listeners a bit of background about this series, again, the title of the series is Israeli Apartheid Through South African Eyes. This is our third episode in a 6-part series. The previous episode, the topic was, how applicable is the term apartheid to the state of Israel? And tonight we have the topic of apartheid, the chosen people, and the colonization of God. So if we can get started, how are you doing, Professor Farid Esack?
I'm doing well, alhamdulillah, despite the many years of public speaking. I've never managed to quite leave behind my sense of anxiety before a presentation. So yeah, there we go. But well, pull through this like I've pulled through many others, for better or for worse.
Okay, sounds good, Prof. We look forward to having you again. So I'll get us started. Our first question for tonight in relation to the topic, Professor Esack, is in one of our previous webinars, you spoke about how someone who has lived, survived under, and fought apartheid, as opposed to those who lived on it or off of it, meaning maintaining it. So those who survived and fought under apartheid cannot be struck by the similarities of those who live and die under apartheid Israel. Can you tell us a bit more about your earliest memories as a victim of apartheid in South Africa?
First of all, Alex, I'm a teacher, so I can't but help notice when people speak or errors that they make. I think you said they cannot be struck. And I think you meant to say they cannot but be struck by the similarities of those who live and die under apartheid. Okay, sorry, but this is the eternal teacher in me. Mercifully, I'm also willing to be taught. First of all, one of the limitations in tonight's talk, and somebody can tongue-in-cheek say this is very typical of liberation theologians. In working through the talk, with always too busy, limited preparation time and so on, I didn't actually get much time to get to the role of God in all of this. Okay, so I'm afraid that we will have to work that in another time, but people will say this is typical of liberation theologians. It's far more about theology and liberation rather than about, it's far more about liberation rather than about theology. They always leave God behind. But at some stage, I'm quite sure I'll come back to that in some more detail. So you asked about my earliest memories as a victim of apartheid. Perhaps a victim, a survivor is more like it, but yeah. So I was born in Wynberg. Wynberg is a colored suburb, and I'll come back to this colored, these terms, quote unquote, colored suburb of Wynberg. And there we had one of those things that many academics theorize about. We had a community. There were 3 mosques. There were 2 primary schools for Muslims, a Muslim home for the aged. There's a large community hall, several madrasas where we learned the basics of our faith. There was also, of course, a number of churches and schools for Christians with whom we shared a common space. The adhan, call to prayers, church bells, knowledge of who lived in the houses all along the street and their occupations, whom they were connected with, what were the smells of their houses and their cooking. We knew it all because lives were shared. Now, this shared living that I may now be nostalgic or romantic about came to a rather abrupt end on the edge of South Road, because our homes, and South Road was the dividing line between Wynberg, which was colored area, and Plumstead, which was white area. It was a relatively narrow road, I mean, just a 2-lane road. And because we were colored, later on, we literally ended up on the wrong side of the street. Now, you see, the white people, or quote unquote white people, lived across on the other side of South Road. But in between where our homes ended, and our homes ended right on the street, then you had the road, and then you had a paved path all along the beginning of South Road, right until the end near the train station. But between that pavement, walking pavement, and the white houses on that side was what we called the land, the land. It was a large grass patch that ran all along South Road on the white people's side to act as a buffer between us and them. And that is what they were to us, white people. All of what constitutes them, white people, their language, their cuisine, their history, their friendships, their love, their feuds, their sex, their yearnings, their faith, their laughter, their fears, their fetishes. Of all of this, we saw nothing. We only saw the white people. The land, this land, this empty patch, this no man's land in between, other than patches of grass, it had a single pine tree that shed its wheatish pine-colored kernels, well, wheatish-colored pine kernels in hardened shells rather stingily. And this is what drew us to the field, the white side, ever so often. And the white people, trapped in their own hardened shells of superiority, equally ever so often called the police to chase us off the land. And of course, if this were in Israel, they wouldn't call the police. They would just come out with their guns themselves. And these were the good whites, because in that area, most of those whites voted for the United Party, then the official opposition party to the more pronouncedly racist Nationalist Party. Now, the colored people of Wynberg weren't allowed to live across on that side of South Road. And so we expanded on top of each other. One shed after the other went up in the yard as uncles and aunties married and did the kind of thing that keeps this whole humankind story going. And they had their own children. And then one day, my mother, being the eldest of her family and her brood, had to make space for the younger ones. So we moved across the road. a bit like the Palestinians, who are often forced by life itself to build another story on top of their small dwellings. So occupying a small strip on the white side of the road, we nevertheless posed a threat to the security of white people. Now, of course, as we increasingly know, and as so vividly manifested in this United States of America, white people are entitled to life within secure and safe borders. And they determine the extent of security, and they determine the need of their safety, regardless of how paranoid or effed up or they may be. But they're the only determinants of what security and safety is. So here on the white side of the road, in the backyard, there was another white family. Sorry, there was another black family that lived there. But this extended black family, they were more illegal than what we were. Because according to the apartheid definition, we were colored and we were more entitled to be in that part of the country than what black people were. So as an aside, you know, there's various levels of legalities for the indigenous people. It is something very similar to what Palestinians experience under apartheid. Other than that, noise, for example, of playing on the land, we also brought crime to the area. We sometimes damaged the plants and the flowers of the white people when they slammed their doors on us, when we went begging for food at their houses, and they set their dogs on us. So in small or big ways, we were a threat to their safety and their security. Yeah.
If I can possibly interrupt for a moment, Prof. Farid, you speak about the whites. Sometimes you use inverted commas, and sometimes you just say, by inverted, I mean, you go like this, whites, and other times you just say whites. Isn't that being racist? I mean, in the case of Palestine, one can really never get away with talking about Jews, no matter how committed one is against anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's, that's a fascinating question. You know, I, of course, being deeply committed to the struggle against anti-Semitism, I always make sure that I make this distinction. But a friend of mine, Jonathan Brown, he asked me an interesting question. He asked me, what did you guys call whites in apartheid South Africa? So, I never thought about it. We just call them whites. So I then posted a message on my Facebook page to ask other South Africans, what did we call them? And there was universal agreement that we just said whites. We just described them as the whites. And every single leader in our liberation struggle, Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, Chris Hani, Tenjiwe Mtinso, other whites like Helen Joseph, the great Jewish leader of our armed struggle, Joe Slovo, all of them, they just spoke about whites. We never said, well, there was a tendency, the unity movement, that spoke about the Herrenvolk, which is a German word for the lordly class, the lordly class. But in our public meetings, we would sing, Amabulu, Azizinja, Amabulu, Azizinja, Amabulu, Amabulu, Azizinja. The Boers are dogs, the Boers are dogs, the Boers are dogs, the Boers are dogs. And we sang this in churches. And there were many whites amongst us. And these whites sang with us. It was common knowledge amongst us that the whites that we are speaking about, they the racist whites. They're not the comrades. And not once did any of our white comrades ever point out, why are you saying whites? I'm also white. They knew exactly that we talked about white supremacy. We spoke about the vast majority of whites. They were on the stages with us. They were in the meetings with us. They sang along with us. The Boers are dogs. Not once Wilhelm Verwoerd, the grandson of the architect of Apartheid, who became a member of parliament for the African National Congress. Wilhelm and his then wife Melanie, Beyers Naudé, one of the great prophets of South Africa and an Afrikaner, a Boer, not once did they say, are you talking about me? No, they just didn't have those hang-ups. But these hang-ups come from the privileged classes, when them and their sensitivities and how you describe them, that must become the focus of your life and your discourse and so on. And this must become your obsession. Their identity anxieties, their guilt, their whatever. So in South Africa, so in many ways, the fact that you now have to exercise the super carefulness about what you speak, it has far more to do with white privilege than what it has to do with any real anti-Semitism, and even less than anti-Semitism as a serious, active force with any kind of economic power behind it. In the way that people talk about black racism. There may be something called black racism, but it has nothing akin to the economic, the institutional, the systemic power that white racism has behind it. So to talk about white racism and black racism in the same term, it's bollocks, you know? And so we never distinguished between groups of white people in our discourse. Oppressing white, apartheidists, white supremacists. These words were never a part of our vocabulary in South Africa. But two other things, and I must be quick because, yeah. In Palestine, of course, one acknowledges that there has been an indigenous community throughout the ages. But an indigenous community that is an increasingly smaller part of the overall Palestinian population. So in that case, you know, in that situation, I don't know, you may be able to make a case for some distinction between people who oppose Zionism and people who are Zionists. The truth is that unlike our use of white in South Africa, anti-Semitism is a more universal phenomenon on the one hand. So one needs to be careful when you speak inside the world about this because it has different connotations. And at the same time, I don't know if I want to impose this universal obsession to make a distinction onto the Palestinians themselves. The truth is that the daily experience of the ordinary Palestinian, the daily experience that they have of a Jewish person is nearly inevitably, invariably, and universally as an occupier. So am I now going to go on and on about their need to make the distinction between Zionist and Jew and so on? I don't know if who the hell am I to go and impose this onto another people? For myself, an enlightened universalist, I have an obligation to make this distinction, lest people think. Of course, it doesn't prevent people from making this accusation. They make this accusation all the bloody time, despite the numerous articles that I've written against anti-Semitism. But I'm not going to be imposing this kind of distinction, Alex, onto the Palestinian people, whose every single encounter, as I say, virtually every single encounter with a Jew is that of an occupier, notwithstanding the existence of a number of good organizations amongst many of the Jews who want to mitigate the effects of the occupation or the effects of discrimination or just Palestinian life under Zionism. There are many, many Jews and Israelis who are pained by this and who identify with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, both in the international community as well as in Israel itself.
If I can move on to a slightly different topic now, Prof. Farid. So of course, the history of dispossession and colonialism in South Africa did not start in 1948, but long before, with the occupation of the Dutch in 1652. In 1948, though, it seemed a much more formal, legal, and reified character through a so-called democratic election process brought the National Party to power. Can you tell us more about this and specifically the Group Areas Act that saw your homes in Wynberg in Cape Town bulldozed and your family being forcibly removed to God alone knows where?
Well, so we were then living on the wrong side of the road. So technically, although in our hearts we were living in Wynberg, technically, according to Apartheid, we were living in Wynberg because it was on that side of the road, this two-lane road. So the Group Areas Act was brought into force 2 years after the Nationalist Party came to power in 1948 in, quote unquote, South Africa's only functional democracy, okay? And never mind that the indigenous, that the occupied indigenous South Africans were disenfranchised. Not all of them, some of them, the colored people, many colored people had the vote if they had enough money in this qualified franchise. According to the Group Areas Act, specific areas were established for people who were classified as colored, white, or Indian and black. Now, the use of these terms were imposed, and like all racist myths, they bear little or no reality to reason or to science. Members of a particular group were limited to engage to social interaction in activities such as commerce, industry, but could share residence only with members of that particular group. And each group was compelled to live in their own area. No black, colored, or Indian person could own property in a white area. And if you lived there, usually as a domestic worker with special permission. The regime had the self-confidence to claim that any part of the land that God had set aside for them, this is where they could stay. I remember, very ironically, a Zionist friend of mine from high school, and by the way, of course, all our schools were completely segregated, but I was part of an organization, a high school organization, National Youth Action. In fact, I became the national chair of the organization when I was in the second last year of my high school. And it was there when I encountered some of these liberal whites. And one of them was a Zionist. So he made a joke with me about the architect of apartheid and its first prime minister, Hendrik Verwoerd. And I found the joke funny at that time. And the irony of his own Zionism escaped me completely. He said, who after Moses led the largest number of people from one place to another upon instruction from God? And his answer, his funny answer to that was, Verwoerd. That's the architect of apartheid. Of course, I never had the presence of mind to ask him, Paul Edzin was his name. I never had the presence of mind to ask him, oh, isn't this also the case of Zionism? So what was happening here was a fusion of two mandates. We are democracy, and the democracy has brought this government to power. And the other mandate was, God has given us this mandate. So depending on who they were arguing with, they invoked the different kind of logic. And it's the same very much in the case of Israel. We are a democracy. Our laws are these things. This is what they tell when they tell other people from other democracies. Internal, the discourse is, it's about God. It's about the Hebrew Bible, and that's when they're talking among themselves, or when they're talking to their right-wing Christian Zionist friends in, well, I was about to say largely the south of the United States, but elsewhere also. So for them, Black ownership of the land didn't matter, because you can't argue with God. And besides, the government had a democratic mandate from the white electorate. So the Group Areas Act, which for people from the community that I come from, the colored community, and for many in the Black community, it was just one of the series of laws that dispossessed Black people in the land of our birth. But there were a host of others. Now, this kind of thing generally works best, you know, with projection and so on, but at some stage in the latter 5 or 10 years of my life, I may get to that stage where I evolve into with the ability to also use this razzmatazz and screens and so on. But very quickly, three of those, and I'll conclude this section on this. 4 of them. The one was the Native Land Act. In 1913, Africans were prevented from owning or acquiring land outside land delimited as scheduled areas. So the Native Land Act in 1913, that was the beginning, the serious beginning of denying Africans, Black Africans, their land. The Native Urban Act of 1923 prohibited them from establishing settlements in urban areas, except in segregated areas. Thirdly, the Native Administration Act of 1927 gave the president the authority to define the boundaries of land allocated to particular groups and to order the removal of members of a particular race group without prior notice. And finally, the big one came in 1950, 2 years after apartheid. The apartheid state was officially declared, and the same year, 1948, when Israel was quote unquote founded. The Population Registration Act of 1950 declared that the entire South African population were to be classified by race. And this was to be determined through tests that were designed and given by whites. Identity cards, passes were required that people have them at all times, carry their passes with them at all times, and that a national register be kept of the race of every single South African.
So, Prof. Farid, how on earth, I mean, this is a really kind of massive centuries old system that you all were dealing with in apartheid South Africa. How on earth did the system go about classifying an entire country on the basis of race and ethnicity?
Well, Alex, I mean, I don't think that apartheid Israel or apartheid South Africa are particularly unique in this regard. If you just look at India at the moment, and India is a far, probably 10, 20 times the population of South Africa. And India at the moment is undergoing such an exercise. So these kinds of exercises, they're not unique to apartheid states. Although I must say, India is rapidly on its way to becoming an apartheid state. But sometimes, countries even make the arguments that these registers are made, the racial classification, religion, caste classification they made in order to reverse the discrimination of the past. This they argue in theory. In reality, of course, it is mostly used to entrench that discrimination. So the Population Registration Act provided the basis for separating the population of South Africans into different races. And they were now to be classified as white, colored, or native. And later native was changed to Bantu, and later Bantu was changed to African. The law required that people be classified primarily, initially, on the basis of community acceptability. Meaning, if other whites thought and accepted you as a white, then you were white. Okay. Now, by the way, this measure or this criteria, it is one increasingly used in Israel, where when they do try to circumvent the racist argument, they just say, no, these local municipalities, they have the right to determine who can live in them. And the municipality is an entirely Jewish and mostly Zionist one also. And of course, every single application by a Palestinian is rejected as you're incompatible. So now, I mean, Palestinians, it's unimaginable that they even apply anymore. So this was the first ways of determining, are you acceptable to the community? So then you had to prove that you had white friends, that your other family, if your case was a bit mashkook, we're not completely sure. So tell us about your work, tell us where you live, tell us where, and then, okay, so that was one of the earlier ways in which they community acceptability. And then, of course, if the community rejects you, what do you say? You say, this is a democracy, So Palestinians never get through because, well, they're living with local democratic municipalities. In South Africa, subsequent amendments placed greater stress on appearance in order to deal with a particular problem that had emerged, particularly from some colored people. There was the try for white problem, whereby some lighter skinned people, colored people, tried to pass as whites. And there was also the problem much later in early 1970s, when many Portuguese fled from Mozambique and Angola to South Africa when the Caetano regime was overthrown in Portugal, and Mozambique and Angola were then liberated. Partly as a result of the struggle of the Angolans and Frelimo in Mozambique. And then there were some kind of Portuguese who we couldn't figure out, are they white? Do they look more colored? It's like, the southern, the Latino look, the Latin look in Italy or Spain. So there are many of those poor people, who couldn't pass the test for being white. So the regime defined a white person as one who, and I quote, in appearance is obviously a white person and is generally not accepted as a colored person, or is generally accepted as a white person and is not in appearance obviously not a white person. So this was part of their madness. Now, of course, in terms of classification, classification is a serious matter in racist societies. Very, very serious matter. And so in Israel, for example, you have different groups of Arabs. You have the Eastern, the Arab or the Eastern Jews. And they've been internally colonized versus, on the one side, versus the Muslim Christian Arabs staying inside Palestine, okay? And then you have the Africans, the Ethiopian Jews being colonized in relation to the Black Arabs who are also staying, the Palestinians, and then the more recent phenomenon of the African asylum seeker, many being Muslims and Christians, being horribly treated inside Israeli society. So, I mean, yeah, not talking about Israel at the moment, but there are also these different levels of categorization and a permanent search for fine-tuning this and battles inside them. I mean, the definition of who is a Jew and the battles amongst the Orthodox, the Orthodox and the Hasidim, the contestations inside Judaism between Orthodox Judaism on the one hand and conservative and reformed or progressive Jews on the other, on who has the right to determine that somebody is a Jew and what, and it's like ferocious battles that are going on amongst them. But these are inevitable in a society that is obsessed with the purity of inclusion and the concomitant, the necessity of exclusion.
So I found very interesting the way this example that you had, Professor Farid, of some people like the Portuguese who came in and the system couldn't tell, are these people colored, are they white? I think I've heard stories before too in South Africa of, I believe it was an East African group of people from what is now in East Africa, and they got stranded on a ship in what is now Durban. And these people were Black, and they happened to also be wearing, they're Muslim and they're wearing Muslim garb. And then the apartheid system classified them as Indian. So this is all very interesting, but how did this kind of process play out in the daily lives of people under apartheid?
Well, look, man, I'm actually glad, you know, that I can genuinely smile about it. I mean, there is something kind of horrific about all of this. There's also absurd and hilarious at the same time. But it can only be absurd and hilarious, or it can only be hilarious after the event. So this whole classification business was a really messy and an extraordinarily arbitrary affair. I mean, look, you know, the truth is, there is no real white or Black person. Behind me is a white board. And here you have the Africa for Palestine listings, and this is Black. I've never seen a person of this color. I've never seen a person of this color. So what is this? It's like, okay. So one of the crazier manifestations was the pencil test. If the authorities doubted the color of a person's skin, they resorted to a pencil in the hair test, where they put a pencil, if we're not sure if you're colored or you're Black. So they would put a pencil through your hair, and if it remained in the person's hair without dropping, it signified really frizzy hair or coarse hair. Then the person would be classified colored, African. If the pencil dropped out, the person would be classified colored. Okay, now you told a quick story, Alex, but I mean, that's another case of real absurdity. So this ship from Zanzibar ran ashore in Durban, And there were all these men on the ship that had Arab gowns on. South Africa had no relationship with Tanzania, to which Zanzibar was attached, and no negotiation. So South Africa was forced to take these Zanzibaris in. What do we do with them now? Okay, but they're not black because they were wearing these jubbas, they had beards, they spoke Arabic, and the other people that used Arabic, not spoke it, but used it, were these Indian Muslims. And those other people wore similar clothes to those. Okay, so the Zanzibari Muslims ended up living in an Indian township in Chatsworth, on the outskirts of Durban, where until today there is still a Zanzibari Muslim community classified as Indian. If you were white and the law, on the night of the law, found you married to a colored person, you became colored. If you were white and you embraced Islam, you were reclassified Malay. So it's a complete mess. Anyway, so my family was classified colored in terms of the Population Registration Act of 50. So my father was a Muslim, but of Indian origin. My grandfather, in fact, comes from Gujarat in India. So, but my father left our family when I was very small. That's another story. And so we grew up with my mother. And my mother was a Muslim, apparently of Malay origin. So this made us, in the eyes of the regime, Cape Malay. And Cape Malay was one of the 7 categories of colored. The first 6 categories were spelled out. And just in case you didn't fit into one of those categories, you could always be shifted into the 7th category, other colored. And the one funny story, my lighter-skinned sister, my lighter-skinned sister-in-law, her name is Latifa, which in Arabic means gentle or sweet or kind, but in Urdu it means a joke. Okay, so that's I'm clarifying this. Anyway, her name is Latifa. She still remembers the countless difficulties she had at bus stops because the white buses would stop for her. But she could not get in because she was colored, although she was light-skinned. And the non-white buses passed her by because the drivers presumed she was white. So this was like some of the absurdities of this.
So, Prof, can I possibly interject for a moment?
Yes.
I find this mixing very interesting. Do there happen to be any kind of, did people cross over from being white to colored, or were there like statistics on this type of stuff? Someone was Indian and then they became black, or black and became, was that something that happened?
I mean, yeah, look, I'll come to that in a moment, Alex. But so now this bus story that I just told you, that's like, it's a smallish price to pay for this madness. But there were some really painful consequences of this obsession with race. The prohibition of mixed marriages in 1949 made marriages between whites and members of other racial groups illegal. And in 1950, that was extended to sexual relations between whites and blacks. So there could be no sex across the color bar, inside marriage or outside marriage. And then there's a really sad story, man. I don't know if I have the time. I probably don't have the time to read it, but perhaps I should, okay. So in 1950, Raymond the Prof met a waitress by the name of Diana Bassick working in a Cape Town restaurant. They soon fell in love. Yet because she was classified as colored, her mother was white, her father unknown. So they were only able to meet in secret. Raymond recalls how frightened they were of being discovered. But after a while, they decided to run the risk and move into a house together. Their first son was born 6 years later. And then they moved into a house in an Afrikaans residential area, posing as a white married couple. That a total of 5 children, who were all classified as coloreds. Now, according to the law, their children should have received their schooling in another area, in a school for coloreds. However, in order to keep up the appearance of being white, this family educated their children as best as they could at home. They regularly applied for Diana and the children to be reclassified as white, yet all their applications were refused, and marriage under the law as it then stood was impossible. At the age of 19, their eldest son, Graham, started dating an Afrikaner girl. She became pregnant. Once again, marriage was impossible, since according to their classification, they belonged to different races. Graham's response was so desperate that he threw himself in front of a train and was killed instantly. And a few weeks later, the Duprov's remaining 4 children were reclassified as white. Meanwhile, the partner, they couldn't marry because of the Immorality Act. She had to wait until 1980 before she was reclassified. And all her white friends had to put in writing that they regarded her as being an acceptable white. But your question, Alex, to come to it. There were people, yes, of course, with the race being now tied to privilege. Countless South Africans tried to improve their status by trying to be reclassified. Others just tried to negotiate a more bearable existence, to enter into a higher category of what it means to be human in South Africa. But the madness of this is seen in the responses to parliamentary questions. Remember, we were living in a democracy, as Israel always reminds us. There was this fascinating character, Helen Suzman. She died in 2009, probably around about between 80 and 90 years old. She was Jewish, and she was a plucky liberal member of parliament. The only decent woman, well, there was another one, what was her name? Catherine something, who was relatively decent, but belonged to the United Party. But Helen Suzman was, by many standards, the only decent member of parliament. And by the way, she was a member of parliament for the constituency just next door here for Houghton. Now, Helen would ask every year in parliament, she would ask the Minister of Interior, what is the statistics of people who changed? So some of the statistics, in 1986, 9 whites turned to coloreds, 2 whites turned to Malay, 506 coloreds, 14 Malays, 9 Indians, 7 Chinese, and 1 Griqua turned to white, 40 coloreds turned to black, 87 coloreds turned to Indian, 26 coloreds turned to Malay, 2 other coloreds were turned to Indian, 1 other color turned to black, 5 blacks to other Asian, 666 blacks to colored, 10 blacks to Indian, 2 blacks to Malay, 18 blacks to Griqua, and so it goes on and on and on. This horrific madness.
Yes. If I can possibly just reflect with you, Prof. Farid, this reminds me of the situation in apartheid Israel, where you have a number of the indigenous Palestinian peoples who, after 1948, once Israel was created, you had different groups of Palestinians who tried to also become Israeli. So there was a group of this religious minority, the Druze, who decided to accept Israeli citizenship, and in exchange, they were forced to serve in the Israeli military. I think they're one of the main examples in apartheid Israel of former Palestinian Arabs becoming Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis. And there's a few other communities that also did this in apartheid Israel. Some of the Bedouin tribes also developed this relationship of kind of race, becoming traitors to their race. And more recently, very small amounts of Arab Christians in Israel. And all this race stuff and classifications, I mean, I find it very fascinating. I think our viewers find it very, very interesting to understand what apartheid was like under South Africa, in South Africa, and I mean, by correlation also in apartheid Israel. But we are kind of running low on time. So I was curious if I can skip a few questions that I had planned for this and maybe return to.
You may also want to just wind up, Alex. I mean, but yeah, you can carry on if you want to ask me another question, and then we should call it quits, really.
Okay, I think I'd like to return back to a bit of your personal story under apartheid that we were touching upon earlier in this webinar. So you described what it was like growing up in Cape Town, in Wynberg, being forced to Bothaville. So, I mean, as time passed on, what happened to that Wynberg that you left behind?
Oh, years later, as Wynberg became one of the numerous hubs of resistance to apartheid, that solitary pine tree that I remember so much of my childhood on the field that served as a buffer zone between whites and colored, that pine tree was joined by a whole array of fierce-looking armored security vehicles, buffles, rattles, and yellow mellows, we call them. And these vehicles would park there for long periods, providing these whites with shade, cover, a sense of illusionary security, which gently distances itself as the sun moves on. The walls of their secure homes had simultaneously become the walls of their prisons. The children for whom a decade ago the police was so regularly called because we were noisy in our search for pine kernels, we had grown up wanting more than pine kernels. We had grown up demanding justice and quite determined to make apartheid ungovernable. This was our quest. It became sacred to us to disturb the norm. It became an historical responsibility to ensure that there is going to be no peace without justice. And so as we were determined to smash the hardened shells to get something sustaining inside those pine kernels, so we were now determined to smash the apparatus of the apartheid state, to get something that will sustain all the people of our land, freedom and justice for all its citizens in an undivided South Africa.
Sure. So, okay. I wanted to ask another question about also what happened to Bothaville, the location in Cape Town, the colored township you were forced to. But I don't think we have time. We only have time for about one more question. So if I can ask, I mean, we've been talking about the difference in the different racial groups, some having relatively more privilege than others. So in some ways, I'd like to ask you, Professor Farid, in some ways, was being colored relatively more privileged in relation to Blacks, or to use the apartheid term, Africans? And how did being colored or so-called colored relate to so-called colored? How did coloreds relate to Blacks in relation to their privilege?
Okay. Well, I mean, the story that I narrated of our family, of course, it's a real story of apartheid. And in many ways, at least in impact, it is akin to that of the Palestinians who live in what is described as Israel proper. The much harsher face of apartheid, though, was reserved for those who were Black. And then too, a relatively less ruthless ride for those who were given permits amongst the Blacks to live in the distant outskirts of the cities on the one hand, and those who were consigned to the Bantustans, the apartheid designated areas for specific Black tribal communities, or what they called nations, where they were supposed to exercise their own independence. A solution pretty much along the lines of what in the case of Israel and Palestine is touted as the two-state solution. The one major difference, though, is that the Israeli proposals or impositions of these maps is really a pathetic and cruel joke in relation to that of apartheid or South African apartheid maps. Given half a political will on the part of the Black people in South Africa, the maps that the apartheid regime produced could have had a chance as viable, independent, contiguous territories. But we Black South Africans denied them the political will. And we insisted that we wanted a united, an undivided, and a non-sexist South Africa for all of those who live in it, including for whites. But the funny one is, and if I may end on this note, the funny one is that in the case of South Africa, the world dreamt that dream along with us. But in the case of Israel, the respectable dream, the permanent nightmare of a divided apartheid state, is seen as the solution. So Black people in South Africa are viewed as open to humanness, they seem to be saying. South African white people are capable of adapting, they seem to be saying. But there in the Holy Land, evil and virtue flow in the blood of all the people. The Jews are incapable of ever regarding the Palestinians as human, and the Palestinians are regarded as evil incarnate, inherently incapable of grace and forgiveness. So the tragedy is that apartheid was regarded, the end of apartheid was regarded as a solution for the people of South Africa, and the entrenchment of apartheid is regarded as a solution for the people of Israel and Palestine. We may end on that note, Alex. Thank you very much to the listeners, to the viewers for signing in and for your patience in my running over time.
Well, thank
and not
you,
exactly
Prof.
sticking to the topic either.
Well, if there's one thing that we can just maybe really drill and drive home to our viewers, I mean, the similarities between what Professor Farid described in apartheid South Africa are at play right now live during this live webinar in apartheid Israel. So all these different ways, different groups in South Africa, they were divided by race. The same thing is happening in apartheid Israel. Jews of Arab descent don't see themselves as connected to the non-Jewish Arab Palestinians inside Israel and the occupied territories. Ethiopian Israelis don't see their struggle against racism against the non-Black Israelis as tied to that of the Palestinians or the Afro-Palestinians. Many Israeli leftists, they want to fight for social democracy inside Israel, but they don't see themselves as part of Palestinian resistance against apartheid and colonial occupation. So, I mean, there's so many different ways. If we can just, realize the interconnectedness of the way that apartheid worked in South Africa and in Israel, and we'd really like to thank Prof. Farid for illuminating that for us tonight, and in a very personal way too, in his own journey as a victim and eventually a victor against apartheid. So thank you, Prof. We really appreciate your time.
Afwan, it's a pleasure and a duty.
So last notes, and we'll end very quickly. Thank you to all of our viewers who've tuned in from across the world. Next week's topic, again on Wednesday, will be political Zionism and the cocoa colonization of God. We invite you to join us again and to spread the word with your friends. And last of all, and apologies, again, this is only for our South African-based viewers. We are selling these really, really wonderful, awesome, cool Palestinian Kofia face masks. They are made with this material, the Kofia material, imported from Palestine, and they are manufactured locally here in South Africa. So you are supporting both the Palestinian economy and the local economy. They are going for 90 Rand each, and you can order them by emailing shop@africaforpalestine.com. The 4 in Africa for Palestine is the number 4. Again, that's shop@africaforpalestine.com. There's a limited stock. There's courier delivery, as well as local distributors in Cape Town, Durban, Polokwane, and possibly a number of other places. Check out the Africa for Palestine Facebook page for more information. Thank you. Shukran, gracias to all of our viewers. We'll see you next week. Amandla.
Where to?